when we're in a conflict, do we know what type of conflict that we're in? Studies show that the answer is a big fat no. It's usually I do not know what type of conflict I'm in. I usually don't even know what to put words to in terms of like what just happened.
That narrative led to me feeling the way that I did. Now, it doesn't discharge blame from the other person, which is what a lot of people think, that if I own this and I'm getting that person off the hook. No. But a healthy relationship is both people being willing to show up and own their part. Hey everybody, it's Bianca.
Welcome back, Evolvers. It's Emilia. We're grateful to have you in another episode. And today is going to be all about interpersonal dynamics, specifically not just intimate relationships, because, I don't think that would be doing everyone the justice that we all need here. It's going to be all things how to repair a relationship rupture. So what Bianca and I had been talking about just prior to recording this episode was the fact that in the front of the scenes, everyone loves and thinks that everyone has, a good life and everything's all just rainbows and butterflies. But when you actually pull the curtain back and you look behind the scenes, which we are so privileged to have, we can share and attest to the fact that people have a lot of relationship issues. And yes, I know that's very surprising. The relationship issues that we have in our life are probably the biggest anxiety-provoking pain and suffering that if you look back on people's lifetime, it usually is directly attributed to how people have not learned how to navigate the relationship conflict and specifically the repair process that we're going to be getting into in this episode. And because whether they've been avoiding it or whether they're freaking out and their anxiety, whatever that is, it's brought more pain and suffering to this world than I personally think and believe we really need. And so when we haven't been taught the interpersonal dynamic elements that are so important for having, growing, and developing wonderful relationships around us, of course, we're going to be living in a state of just that activation of anxiety, of freak out. When someone says, I need to talk to you, it goes immediately into the OS. What do we need to talk about? So it's everything from intimate partnerships to your friendships, to your family, the relationships that you have at work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How do we repair a relationship rupture when that happens? So B, I know I've asked you this already, but I'm going to ask it again. So does it surprise you that when I was younger, around like 7 to 9 years old, from that very young age, that was when I started to really notice that people gravitated towards me asking me, hey, Emilia, what do I do about this? What do I do about that? Whether it be their cute little boyfriends or girlfriends, what they're trying to do with their relationships, or it was, how do I navigate this relationship with my teacher, or how do I navigate this situation with my parents or my siblings, etc. Does that surprise you?
You predicted the future at 3 years old, so no, that doesn't surprise me.
Okay. All right. So,
That's a story for another time, but
story for another time for sure.
No, that does not surprise me.
So, thank you. So the reason why I say that is because I had mentioned this before, but I want to share it here again, which is I have had a natural gift of relationships and interpersonal dynamics, meaning that it has come naturally to me. And it is what we refer to as an unconscious competency, which is I don't really have to put a lot of work into it, like in contrast to someone else who might have to study the ins and outs of interpersonal dynamics and relationship structures to be able to be quote unquote good at relationships. That comes naturally and is a gift of mine. And so that unconscious competency has been grown since like I was very, very young. And Bianca's being very sweet over there, smiling with respect to that. But I also am coming from a standpoint of not just has it been a gift, but it's also been something that I've academically studied and taken a lot of education around as well. And so not only do I sit in the seat and share this dialogue with all of us and say that I have struggled too, I have failed in relationships, I have had plenty of ruptures that I struggled to repair. Some of this stuff where it was never taught, even someone who is gifted in the relationship rupture and repair process can still struggle. And I say that because knowing that I have this gift and knowing still that I struggle, it's brought me to research and learn so many things that I've found to be very helpful for people. Meaning definitions that we don't have coming into the realm when we talk about interpersonal dynamics, tools and systems to help us connect to what we all biologically have, which is our biological need and imperative to belong. And studies show again and again, and the research continues to come out in this academic and in the scientific literature, that when we have healthy relationships that can navigate conflict, not avoid it, but navigate conflict, studies show that your relationships are a functional tool to help improve your longevity, improve your health, improve your overall mental health and well-being. And so if we can look at relationships as a tool, as a means, as a function and a system for our overall betterment of our mental health, our well-being, our health and wellness, and a long, healthy, fulfilling life, and we have the tools within our pockets to be able to navigate those ruptures and the repair process, then we can walk around in our day-to-day lives instead of in this kind of in-between show of pretending that everything's good on the surface and then behind the scenes feeling really anxious, depressed, sad, and lonely. We can actually have those two worlds meet. And we don't have to mask up and we don't have to pretend like nothing's wrong. Instead, we can have real conversations with each other from a place that's heart-centric and from a place that is well-informed about how we can have better relationships and thus a better life.
Yeah. Relationships are hands down the number one problem that every single person has. Any problem, if you dissect it enough, is an interpersonal relationship problem. Every single problem comes down to an interpersonal relationship problem, and yet none of us are taught how to have and or be in healthy relationships. What do you do when things go bad? How do you make sure that it doesn't go bad? How do you ensure that you're doing all of the things necessary to make this the absolute best it can be? People think that we're all just supposed to have a natural proclivity to it, and that we are just supposed to have an unconscious competency when it comes to interpersonal relationships. I want to touch on something that you said.
Bianca and I shared a quote earlier that had that word involved, and we had quite a funny conversation just before this podcast. So,
pardon the giggle.
Bear with us.
I want to highlight something. You have it as an unconscious competency, but you didn't rest on your laurels. You also studied and studied and studied. If you ever see Emilia's home, there's more books than almost anything else. You might have more plants. Between books and plants.
I'm like 100 plus species of plants. Now we are going into the arachnoids, but books still stand as the number one.
Whether it's physical books or digital books. And they've all been read and studied. I think that's the crazier thing. Like, you've done the work. So, no, it doesn't matter if you have an unconscious competency to this. We all have to learn just like anything else. So, this is really what we're going to be diving into today. All of our lives are improved if we have better relationships. And the biggest thing that gets in the way of good relationships is not knowing what to do when problems happen, because let's face it, it is inevitably going to happen. If you are in a relationship, there are going to be issues. That's fine. The thing to focus on isn't not having issues, it's what do you do when they come up. So that's what we're going to dive into today.
Exactly. So one of the, I really appreciate you mentioning that, B, and it is interesting to look at, if I were to think about the accumulated belongings that I have more books than anything. that is in my possession and has ever come into my possession. And
Facts.
I care so deeply about my books. I always said, like, you know, when they have those jokes of like, if your house were to burn down, what would you bring with you? Like my books are on my list. Like if I could just like, anyways, with that being said, one of the things that, you know, I've had conversations with individuals who have been in special ops, who have been in high tiers of high pressure situations, and that if the way in which they operate has a big impact. So for example, if you're in the special ops, you are not necessarily concerned on what will go right. You are more concerned about what will go wrong, because you know, and you're not naive in the fact that things are going to go wrong. And when it comes to relationships, I want us to encourage all of us to think about that we are humans. We are messy. We are sloppy. We are growing. We are evolving. We are imperfectly perfect. And that's the way I like to put it, because there's so much going on in our worlds that when we show up into our lives, we're not 100% all the time. And that is a guaranteed. So when we know that, and when we accept that from an interpersonal dynamic standpoint, we can plan and prepare to have failures, to have setbacks, to have messy action taking place when it comes to the interpersonal dynamics at play. And so when you can think about that from okay, if I know that inherently embedded within humans is that we make mistakes, and people struggle, and people don't know how to talk about their relationships, specifically if it's between you and that person, because of the fact that we haven't had a lot of education around this. Of course there's going to be shame. Of course there's going to be avoidance. Of course there's going to be, let's sweep things underneath the rug. And when we know that that's a guaranteed, we can actually plan for how to navigate that when the storms come. It's not if the storms come, it's a when. And so if we prepare for that, we can better handle that. And that's what this episode is all about. And the first thing that I want to get into, even before the ruptures begin, is recognizing as a leg and a testament to the Gottman labs and the research participants, the research helpers when it comes to the Gottman labs and the research that they've done around great relationships. One of the things that I often say when it comes to people that are turning towards me with relationship guidance and interpersonal dynamics guidance is that, you know, ultimately you're in this rupture or you're in a conflict right now because that is one of the biggest elements of exceptional relationships, is to have and to navigate productive conflict. So I'm actually, whenever I hear someone bringing me their challenge or problem that someone fought, I'm like, I'm excited for you. Like, that's actually really great news. You're not masking up anymore. You're not pretending you're someone that you're not. Like, you're actually having a rub of resistance because you're actually finding where the edges of you are and where those end and where the beginning edges of someone else begins. You're not in a meshed dynamic. You actually understand that you're individuals at the core. And so conflict is one of the foundational pillars of exceptional relationships. The others are authenticity, vulnerability, trust, things like honesty, and ultimately a commitment to growth. But it's what we do in the conflict that makes the biggest difference. And so when we're in a conflict, do we know what type of conflict that we're in? Studies show that the answer is a big fat no. It's usually, I do not know what type of conflict I'm in. I usually don't even know what to put words to in terms of like what just happened. You've ever been there. B, you and I have talked about this plenty of times. It's like, I don't really know what happened, but like, we're kind of feeling disconnected. And, I don't like, I'm feeling some type of way. And I kind of feel like me and my partner or me and this team member or whatever, like got into a little bit of a tiff or a little bit of a fight, and I'm not quite sure what happened. I know I said something maybe I'm not proud of, but ultimately, I know we're in this weird space now. Our relationship is not the same. What happens in that moment is that more often than not, most people do not put the thumb on what type of rupture in their relationship just happened. And so for all of our Evolve listeners, I want to make sure that we go through the 5 different types of relationship ruptures, because when you're in a conflict, usually you do not have the words and the terminology to name it. And that is so important because of how you navigate the repair process, which is what has you finally clearing the air in a way that the relationship can even be better off once you do so.
So step 1 is identifying the type of rupture, which we're about to dive into the five types.
We'll dive into the 5 types and I'll give an example. So the
Nice.
first one is the like smallest type, picture like a sidewalk and like a tiny little scratch or crack in the sidewalk, right? That in the interpersonal dynamic zone is what we call a benign rupture. And in an example like this where essentially there's 2 people in this dynamic, right? And usually when we go into the ruptures, I'm going to put it in the dynamics of 2 people. It can be 2 partners, intimate partners. It could be 2 business partners. It could be 2 friends. It could be 2 family members. It could be a mom and dad, a child and a parent, whatever it is, right? Benign rupture. What happens in that is one party misunderstands the other party. So the individual in this case doesn't actually comprehend the message that the other one is trying to send. So Bianca and I had something that happened earlier this week where I had interpreted a message that she had sent requesting a password for something as totally different than what she had been trying to send, the intention of why she was requesting that. And so it was a minor benign rupture that she and I had experienced in our relationship, a total disconnect where she needed a password like ASAP Rocky. And I wasn't under the impression like that she needed it now and she needed it for a specific purpose. So, but that was so innocent. It was an innocent, tiny, benign rupture. We all have those where it's like, ooh, I didn't really mean that. Let me take it back, like foot in mouth kind of situations, because one party misunderstands what the other party is trying to say, trying to share, trying to get across.
A simpler example is if you're walking and you bump into someone and it's like, oh, geez, sorry, didn't mean it. And it's like, oh, okay, cool, no problem.
Yeah, it's benign. It's small. It's
innocent and it's not, it doesn't impact
Yeah.
like, it would be different if I'm like, Emilia did that on purpose, but it's not. It's an understanding that like, hey, there was a misunderstanding, all good, move forward.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
So as I go up in these ruptures, it's kind of gonna like there's more intensity that's involved. There's more at risk here. There's more of a bigger rupture, if you will, a bigger chasm, a gap that's left when the rupture happens. So even in a benign rupture, though, the repair process that we're going to get into right after this, the 5-step repair process, is so important still to have, because whenever there is a rupture, even if it's on a small scale, that's where all the gold is. Ruptures, that's why I get excited when clients bring to me, like clients, friends, team members, partner, etc. Like they bring to me like, oh, I'm having this situation with this person. I don't really know what to do. I get so excited because in every single conflict, there's an equal, if not bigger proportion of gold on the other side. And that gold represents what you can learn about one another to where you can even grow and become a better relationship as a result of that uncovery or that discovery, for lack of better words. So if you can see relationship ruptures as that, imagine the change in how you navigate them.
Can you guys tell
out.
how, I was going to say, can you guys tell how much Emilia's geeking out about this? This is her jammy jam. It's so fun to see you in your genius zone.
Thanks, B. I love it. And here's why I love it is because if you just look at that quick math, right? Like longevity, better life, better well-being, better mental health, like better. So many betters are as a byproduct of learning what we're sharing in this episode, identifying what the rupture is, and obviously like how you feel about it, the impacts, where it came from, et cetera, and then learning the rupture repair process. It's like, oh my goodness, you can tell me that I can guarantee that I will have a more meaningful, healthier, better well-being and longer life because of this one episode. You're telling me that's what we're talking about right now, and it's for free. And I'm gonna say, yup. Boom, right there. Amazing. Now, can we apply this though, is the question. This is why I get so activated in talking about it, because you and I both well know, like I said at the very beginning, very few people know how to apply this because they don't know it in the first place. But what happens when they start to know it? It's still scary. It still brings a lot of uncomfort, or discomfort rather, right? Because it's like anything. It's like a skill. You need to exercise that muscle. It's not going to inherently be super good when you get on it, right? So anyways, the second type, Anything that you have to add before I go?
I was just gonna
Okay,
say.
cool.
So I was just gonna repeat.
Reiterate.
Reiterate. Refresh. Number 1 is a benign rupture. It's small. It's
Yes.
meaningless. It's insignificant. You move on almost immediately after it happens.
Yep. So long as you. Those are the ones that people will sweep underneath the carpet because it is tiny. But if you don't actually suss it out through the repair process, it could become way more meaningful and create an even bigger rupture.
True.
So with that being said, number 2 is what's called an oscillating rupture. So kind of picture oscillation. I don't know. I picture these 2 palindromes from like a old music class, but I don't think that's going to be a helpful visual. But
2 what?
more dancing. Never mind. It doesn't matter. Picture 2 people dancing. Okay. This is a better analogy. Picture 2 people dancing. One of them is well trained in salsa and thinks that they're going to a salsa class. The other one is trained in classical ballet. The 2 get on the dance floor. The person who has been trained and thinks that she's showing up to a classic ballet, she's ready, and then all of a sudden the music starts going, and it's country. Them trying to figure out how to dance, a salsa dancer and a classical ballerina during a country song, it's going to be like an absolute shit show, for lack of better words. This is what an oscillating rupture feels like in a relationship, because ultimately what happens when you have an oscillating rupture is it's kind of that like feeling in the relationship, because ultimately in this specific and unique rupture, both individuals here that are involved in the back and forth dynamics of the relationship, they have opposite and usually different needs in the relationship itself. And one of those needs often conflicts with the others. So I'll give you a great example that happened recently, and I had a conversation with a client. She went on a skiing trip with her partner and a group of friends. Her need to have the buddy system, because that's what she's been trained on. Don't go up the mountain, don't go and we're talking big ski trip. She's a snowboarder, he's a skier. Her need for safety and psychological protection when she's in a group like that is a big, big need that she had, where you don't go down the mountain and not wait for your partner at the end. She had a need that was going unmet and conflicting and oscillating, which created this rupture in the relationship that I explained to her, because her partner's need was for results. And this happens a lot actually on ski trips. Fun fact. The partner, the male in the relationship, his need was to be socially recognized, significance. He had a significance need that was driving him to try to get as many runs as he could up and down the mountain, because he wanted to make sure that his finances, the $150 or whatever that he had spent, he got his money's worth. So those are 2 needs that were literally directly conflicting, because if she's a snowboarder, and by just the difference between skiing and snowboarding, snowboarders have to like unclip their bindings in order to go across a flat place, whereas like skiers can kind of just do like the I forgot what it's called, it's not pizza, but like a different movement, and you can gain momentum. Snowboarders have to have an actual they have to have lift on their snowboards, and so the pace at which you're able to navigate is totally different. And so as a result of that, they had oscillating needs that were directly conflicting one another. And so she didn't feel safe going up on a chairlift like many behind him, because she's like, I don't know this person right next to me. Like, I don't know these people that we're with. I'm just going to sit in the lodge. And so ultimately that created an oscillating rupture that, if it's not addressed, and this is what I shared with her, if that's not addressed from a standpoint of needs, the different needs that you guys had, then that's going to continue to rupture the relationship. Okay. So that's number 2. The number 3, we're going to start to kind of pick up the pace a little bit on this just for purposes of this episode. So feel free to interject at any point. Okay. So number 3 is what's called a limit setting rupture. So ultimately a limit setting rupture results from any sort of like limits, rules, guidelines that any individual within a relationship, a business, an organization, nonprofit, whatever, or a volunteer effort camp even, right? But this organization individual sets, and the other one finds uncomfortable. The other person finds it constraining, unpredictable, surprising, or limits that organization sets doesn't meet their needs or desires. So for example, a limit setting rupture would be something like another client that I had, where the work that she has, that the work essentially that she has right now, the job that she has there, she's supposed to leave work at 5 o'clock. When her boss asks her, or a coworker asks her to stay for 2 more hours after the time to which she's already agreed to and the limits that have been set within the organization, she's been asked to agree to put in that work consistently. That is a limit setting rupture, because the other person who had initially set the limits, that was okay, but then they went beyond their own limits. And so that took her by surprise, that essentially asked for more than that limit initially that was set. It ruptured the understanding of what that relationship was involved with.
So it's like a boundary violation.
Yeah, pretty much. But it where it becomes very concerning is that it's like not only a boundary, but it's a little bit harder than a boundary. It almost feels as though when a limit setting rupture exists, it feels as though, what I've heard from clients is, it feels as though the repair process is less likely to happen, because usually that might infringe upon not only personal boundaries, but might be or have and result in a moral conflict, if you will.
Okay.
Yeah, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the fourth one, this is, a lot of people know about this one because we've all experienced it, especially in intimate relationships or maybe even friendships, right? This one is when we refer to toxic people. Usually we talk about this, which is the toxic rupture. So the toxic rupture is a little bit more dense than all the ones that I talked about before, because of the fact that one individual within this relationship actually exhibits and demonstrates to the other person unsafe behavior. And that can look at like anything, because of the fact that our levels of safety are so subjective to our own unique set of experiences. But in this definition, let's just call out some obvious toxic, unsafe behaviors in a relationship. Someone who comes at you with violent communication, like yelling, or they lose their emotional control on a consistent basis. They physically intimidate you, whether that be violence or them getting into your space and or intimidating you by means of threatening to throw something or whatnot, right? Ultimately, it's these physically intimidating or toxic emotional, psychological, verbal behaviors that holds another person in this dynamic in contempt, and ultimately that breaks the relationship connection, because it breaks it for the sake of self-preservation. So when you experience a toxic rupture, what you're experiencing is not only the initial abuse of, for lack of better words, the toxic behaviors, emotional, psychological, whatever, but it's also doing that at the sake of self-preservation. So it's a multi-complex rupture that has a lot to do with safety. And so it's multifaceted in that.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, if because Alan and I are in an intimate relationship, and so I'll put it that way, but even if Bianca and I were to yell at each other, that would be a toxic rupture for me, because I hold to such high standards nonviolent communication as the go-to type of communication that I embody. And I ensure that I don't have anyone in my life that is okay with violent languaging, with violent communication. And so if Bianca were to yell at me and it was totally uncalled for, or Alan were, and there was no repair process, that would be a huge red flag to me, and I would be out. I'd be like, nope, all set with this, right? Okay. Last one. So the last type of relationship rupture, this is where especially people who are trauma survivors, people who have had a lot of I would say mental, emotional, psychological abuse too. this one starts to come into the fold beyond that initial safety, because what it's called is actually a safety cue mismatch.
Mm.
And this is where, like I said, everyone's safety cues are a little bit different, but it's actually even more different if you're someone who has a history of trauma, right? Because of the way in which trauma impacts your neurological wiring, for lack of better words, trauma actually impacts and changes the shapes and the functions within your brain and the different components of your brain. And so a safety cue mismatch rupture is when an individual ultimately perceives that there's a threat due to their history of trauma. And therefore, as a result of that, they actually live in that adaptive survival state with toxic shame. This is the key element of this. They live with that survival state with the toxic shame and internal parts of them that have this extreme emotional state because of their trauma, their extreme beliefs and their behaviors. That happens more than I would like to see in this world, where because we've had in the past so much trauma and we've never acknowledged our trauma, we have a safety cue mismatch. So when I might, for example, have Alan, let's just use this tiny example, have Alan raise his voice and yell. Let's say I'm in one room and he's in another room and he's like, did you hear me? But it's at like a elevated yelling tone, because I have had verbal abuse and traumatic experiences with abusive boyfriends. And thus my amygdala has a different neurochemical response, which is igniting more extreme emotions. If he were to ever yell, that's a safety cue mismatch. So the rupture in the relationship happens as a result of me saying, like, did you just yell at me? Like, when in reality, he was just trying to make sure that I was aware of information, and he was being safe at the fact that we were across the room and he needed to project his voice louder. So that's a safety cue mismatch, which ultimately things like that happen all the time. And we don't know that we're in a triggered state. So how do we go through the repair process? B, is there anything that you want to add to this? Because those 5 different types, if we look at our experience, it's like, oh, you can kind of start to categorize them in them.
Can you just restate them?
Yep. So the first one is a benign rupture, which those like tiny, insignificant, but like they still, if they hit the radar, like still make sure that you acknowledge them.
Mm-hmm.
Then you think of the salsa and the ballerina dancer. You have the oscillating rupture. The third one, you're smiling over.
You're getting better with
one,
your examples.
Thank you.
Kind of.
Then you have the limit setting rupture, right? Which is, boundary was a big word that was there. And from there, then you have the toxic rupture. The last one is a safety cue mismatch.
Okay.
Cool.
When you're on a journey of self-discovery or self-rediscovery, it's very important to have a support system in place. And that's where a group like Evolve comes in, with their acceptance and advice and different people from different walks of life who can offer different perspectives for you to help you find your self-worth and aid in your journey of wellness. It's important and essential.
So I'm assuming that like the worse the relationship gets, the higher on the scale the ruptures are getting, because it probably started off with like levels 1 and 2. And then because those kept getting swept under the rug, then those escalated, and then it escalated to number 3. And then number 3 might have escalated to number 4, and so on and so forth. Is that fair to say?
1,000%. That's why when we think about things in terms of like red flags, green flags, orange flags. Orange flags are the sneaky things that are seemingly small, but ultimately it's the frequency at which these occur that build to be red flags. And that's just ultimately, if you project this one tiny benign rupture and you don't have a person that is emotionally mature and psychologically aware and self-aware that they just contributed to a benign rupture and they didn't take ownership and say, wait a second, like, I'm so sorry, there was a misunderstanding. You did that earlier when you talked about one of the episodes that we're going to be producing about wedding dread and all that stuff, right? You literally did that, and you were mature enough to really say like, whoa, I recognize that was, you didn't say it because you didn't know at the time, but like that was a rupture. But you did know that you had ruptured the relationship on some degree and you called that out and you had the emotional maturity and just be apologize. Like, I'm so sorry. I misinterpreted that. And we were off and totally okay. That gives me the psychological certainty that you are self-aware enough in our relationship that I don't have a concern that it's going to continue to escalate. So that's a huge green flag. But what most people do is they think that those tiny things don't really matter. And like what that does to exactly your point, things will always escalate over time. And it's not necessarily an escalation because of escalation's sake. It's because of ultimately what's underneath that, which is the lack of education and self-awareness. Ultimately, that's building it underneath. And the symptoms of that come out in these ruptures.
Absolutely. I mean, the majority of the clients that I've had who are having difficulties in their relationships, and even me, right? But the majority of the clients that I've seen, barring the clients who it's been kind of toxic and abusive from the get, or they were really love bombed and gaslit and then the person's like true colors came out, most relationships, right, the issues didn't start as these really big issues. In the majority of relationships, what happened is it was these small little ruptures over time where repairs never happened. And then the repair grows into resentment. And then resentment grows into the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which John Gottman talks about, which is criticism, contempt, stonewalling, and I'm hardcore blanking on the 4th one. What's the 4th one?
You said stonewalling. I always get the 3rd one wrong too. Stonewalling,
It's stonewalling,
contempt.
Criticism, contempt, and there's another one.
Defensiveness.
Defensiveness.
Not defensiveness. Defensiveness.
Defensiveness.
Yeah. I'm not defensive.
I'm not defensive. You're defensive. You did it, right? Talking about the Darvo effect, which if you haven't listened to that episode, please subscribe and then go listen to that one. It's a really good one. But yeah, the majority of issues that end up happening in a relationship, it's because there are these little ruptures that build over time that turn into resentment that end up turning into these 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So what we're going to dive into now is how to actually go about a repair attempt.
Okay. So because of this episode being so much longer than I expected, right, this is definitely something that we should be doing in Out of the Mud on. And if you want more on this, this is where the coaching, the one-on-one, it really is so big because we not only just help you, but we also educate you. But with this little teaser, I don't want to, gatekeep for that. I really want to make sure that anyone that's clicking into this episode actually has some tactical, tangible takeaways to be able to apply in their practical lives. So don't rush it.
And I think it's worth getting into.
Okay. All right. So now when you think about it, okay, when you have these feelings, right, you now can label a conflict as the conflict is actually what happens before, during, and after a rupture is occurring. Because the conflict kind of is the umbrella of the rupture, how you got to that rupture, the rupture actually occurring, and then the aftermath. That is what we consider the conflict. And so you know what that feels like. Now, when you are in that feeling again, I want you to ask yourself the question, what type of rupture is this conflict a byproduct of, right? Is it the benign? Is it the toxic? Is it the limit setting? Is it the safety cue mismatch, right? Is it the oscillating? All of those are 5 different categories of different types of ruptures that now you can identify, right, and diagnose. And then from there, we move into the repair process as a result of that diagnostic. You wouldn't have as deep of a repair process per se with a benign rupture, right? Because that's more of the smaller things. You would still do that process, but just maybe not as deep and as dense and as sensitive to what's involved, right? As you would to something that is a safety cue mismatch, because of the fact that a safety cue mismatch has literally someone going into a fight or flight, freeze or fawn as a result of trauma in their past, having that rupture have occurred. They misinterpreted based on the trauma that they've experienced. And so there might be some PTSD involved. So the way in which you go about the repair process, though the steps are the same, the sensitivity that's brought within those steps, I just want to be very clear in there. is very different based on the diagnostic of the rupture, right? And that's why a lot of people actually get a third party involved to repair conflict, because they might not have these skills. But anyways, so ultimately it's a feedback process. It's a feedback process of naming your experience. What actually happened? What happened? What was the event? What was the conversation? What was the text that was sent? What was that experience? And the element that comes after that in the feedback process is naming your feelings and your emotions. What did you feel in the moment of that experience, in the moment of that rupture? Name them. I felt like you didn't care about me. The emotion that I felt was anger and frustration, right? Name those and share those with that person. The third component of this is, what story did you tell yourself? Because all of us, when we have a rupture, we are having an inner narrative with ourselves that's creating meaning, that's meaning making, that's literally comprising, help this relationship rupture make sense to us. And so there's a story that we're telling ourselves about it. Share what that story was to the other person. So Brene Brown has given us all language, bless her soul, about the story that I'm telling myself is that you didn't care about me in that moment. The story that I'm telling myself, this is what a client, we went through this, that you cared more about getting more runs in on the mountain than you did about my own safety, right? If you share that with someone, you can hear what that story that she told herself was.
And it's non-attacking.
Right.
If I say to Emilia, the story that I'm telling myself, I'm taking ownership for the fact that I had a narrative. That narrative led to me feeling the way that I did. Now, it doesn't discharge blame from the other person, which is what a lot of people think, that if I own this and I'm getting that person off the hook. No. But a healthy relationship is both people being willing to show up and own their part.
Right.
So
Right.
how many of us, like, I've never once had a partner say this to me, and I've said this to every single one of my partners. How many of us really believe that we would feel so loved and so cared for and so cherished if the person that we were with, whoever it is, an intimate relationship, a friendship, whatever, the person in front of us cared so much about us that they were willing to say, you know what, I'm really in this experience and I really thought this through. And the story that I'm telling myself about this is blah, 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 blah. It's like, oh my God, you actually care enough to like be really thoughtful and to like take my feelings into consideration and understand the fact that you're having a narrative and that's what's coming out. Like, you're not blaming me. How many of us would have amazing relationships if we had people in our lives that did that?
Yeah.
It's
seriously.
beautiful. So don't underestimate that one.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that, B, because something that just came up for me with that is how, like, Bronnie Ware's work, the top 5 regrets of the dying, when it comes to like the relationship element of that, her work in researching people who were, for lack of better words, on their deathbed, when she interviewed them and she got ultimately all the data of the interview process synthesized, she came up with 5 different regrets of the dying. And one of them was, ultimately, I wish I had the courage to express my true feelings. And that, I think, is number 3 out of 5. But like, I remember hearing that and being like, man, and in the context of this episode, if we had the courage to express our true feelings to the people that we love and care about the most, the innermost sticky true feelings that are like, oh, I don't know if I can share this with this person, right? If we had the courage to do that, which is also kind of connected to another one, I wish I had the courage to live true to myself and not the life others expected of me, right? If you were more concerned about you expressing the innermost dialogue, the innermost feelings, the innermost experience that you're having as a result of so many things, and not discharging blame, not leaving it to someone else, that courage allows for this beautiful space of contemplation and dialogue and feedback process to unfold and to bloom into something so much more beautiful than you can even imagine when you're just sinking into those emotions yourself. So once you share with whomever it is that you have a relationship with, rupture with, ultimately you want to, when they're also doing this, obviously this is under the assumption that they're doing this too, because you do it at this kind of same time, and that's important that you're not just the only person repairing the relationship, because it takes two to tango. You ultimately want to reflect what it's hurt. So let's say, for example, you are in the process of you shared the story that you told yourself, and then the person that is also sharing their story, you now are in the position to reflect back to, it's called reflective listening, reflect back to that person that the rupture was in, of what was ultimately heard. So I heard that the story that you were telling yourself was that you don't think that I care for you, or that you don't think that I love you, whatever that is, right? That reflective listening really helps the other person and yourself clarify and check for any opportunities, which is the step number 5. Any opportunities for clarification. You want to check for understanding. Did I hear that correctly? Did I hear that, when we were in the car and we were driving and I was driving a little too fast, that ultimately it was really scary for you, and you felt as though we were not only driving too fast, but you felt as though we were driving very unsafely, and that the emotions that you had were terror and tons of fear and wild disappointment, because the story that you were telling yourself was that you had already shared that you don't want to go over 65 on a 55 limit highway. And so that limit that I thought I had shared, that was being deliberately broken because you cared more. The story that I was telling myself was that you cared more about getting to this event, getting to this party, getting to this barbecue, whatever, than you did about my own personal safety. It's like, whoa, when you hear that, did I hear you correctly? That you felt this way, and that's really what I'm hearing. Is there anything that, I got wrong, or was there anything in that didn't feel like your true innermost feelings? And when you go through that process, you pretty much go back and forth to clarify anything that wasn't fully understood. Or, someone might be like, well, I didn't actually feel really scared. I felt more disappointed. Oh, okay. So you felt disappointed. Like you felt really disappointed. And, well, actually I felt more terror than disappointment, right? Like, oh, okay. So more terror than disappointment. And then you might have, by the time you go back and forth and check for understanding, you might have, there's a saying that Alan and I say at the Conscious Couples podcast. It's never about the bowl. You might think that the one event that happened was because of that one event, but because of this feedback process, because of this repair process you've engaged, you ultimately return to connection as a result of the reconciliation. And that reconciliation comes as a result of seeking to understand rather than to be understood. And that is a byproduct of ultimately you two co-regulating through this feedback process, instead of just trying to get, no, this is exactly what happened, get the details like absolutely factual, right? Like you're speaking from the rupture that occurred within you, you're putting that on the table and you're saying, this was my experience. And you and I both know, and anyone that's listening to this podcast can know, that you can have two people in the same room witnessing an event and their experience is wildly different. So the whole rupture and repair process is about getting those nuances of the differences, the experience itself, the emotions and feelings, the story that they're telling themselves, ultimately what they want to be understood by, and what would be helpful to bring reconciliation and return to connection. Is it needs that are not being met in the relationship? You might find that it totally drifts off into, well, actually 2 months ago when you said this and this and this to my parents, like it can go into such a beautiful, like I said, unfolding. But I say beautiful where most people would be very annoyed by it, because of the fact that now you can see your partner, your friend, your coworker, your colleague to such a different depth than ultimately would have been seen and exchanged from if you just let that rupture fizzle itself out. And far too many relationships, from my opinion, have been not repaired and ultimately lost as a result of not going through this repair process. So in a nutshell, the 5 steps are: the rupture occurs. So what do? You share the experience of what that rupture was for you. Number 2, you begin that co-regulation process by actually naming your own feelings and your emotions, right? naming them out loud helps to actually share with your friend, with your partner, with the other party, what that experience was like, so that you are co-regulating and attuning to one another instead of just being on two separate islands. And then number 3 is when you seek to understand, that is you're seeking to understand yourself. So the story that I told myself that's the 3rd step.
Mm-hmm.
In the 4th step of this is where you're going into more of a reconciliation phase, right? You're trying to name back what you heard and reflect, using reflective listening, reflect what was heard while you shared that. And then from there, if that's correct, or if there's anything that needs to be adjusted, the last is you're seeking to understand any nuances, anything that was off, check for your understanding. And by that, ultimately, that allows you to return to connection. So that is how to repair ultimately a relationship rupture. And if you or anyone that you know is struggling in this arena, like, please use this episode as a tool. Listen to it a couple of times. Name what the rupture was, that conflict that you're in, and then use this 5-step process and let us know how it goes.
This was great. I miss doing in-depth episodes like this. When we were the Y Power podcast back in the day, they were all like this long.
It's so true. I literally am like, my throat hurts. And I'm like, it's not just a throat hurting. It's like oh my goodness, we've shared so much education in one podcast episode. And I miss this.
We did. Yeah, we did. We'll get back to it eventually.
That's where one-on-one happens.
True.
But
True.
Yeah.
True. Or coming to the live events that we do.
True. So B, anything that you want to add to this or close with?
That was great.
Okay.
Actually, I changed my mind. The majority of people that end up coming to relationship counseling, or they're on the brink of like the end of their relationship, it is as a result of years and years and years, or however long the relationship has been, where this has not happened. And the fights, to use what you said, it's never about the bowl. It's almost, when you're at that point, it's almost never about the thing you're actually fighting about. It's usually things that are so much deeper than that. It is so many ruptures and tears and misalignments and hurt feelings and misunderstandings and all of these things.
Salt in the wounds.
So badly. All of these things all wrapped up over years that were never addressed, so that when the person does the most benign thing, you're like a dragon, like unleashing hell. It's because it's not about the thing that just happened. It's about everything that happened before that. It's the straw that broke the camel's back more often than not. So we don't want anyone to get to that point. Believe me, Emilia and I have both been there. It's not cute. So
not fun.
If this is something you need help with, please, please, please do not hesitate to reach out. This is really nuanced. This is really complex. Nobody knows this off the bat, unless you're Emilia, but even she studied the hell out of this. So
yeah. And I'm still studying it. Like, there's still research that is coming out about even just like how attachment styles, right? There's like modern day attachment styles, adult, like anyways.
100%.
Yeah.
Thank you, friend. What is your episode suggestion?
So my episode suggestion for anyone that liked this episode, it has to do with pain. The episode that I'm going to suggest is number 365. I didn't cause my pain. Why do I have to fix it? So many of us experience pain as a direct result of relationship rupture. And if this relationship is worth having in your life, sometimes it is that painful repair process that you got to go through. And so I think that episode will be an ode to that. B?
357, how to tell between your intuition and fear. All right, everyone. We sincerely hope you enjoyed this episode, and we will see you next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.